Okay, welcome everyone to the Happiness Journey with Dr. Dan podcast, where every journey is worth living. My name is Dr. Dan, and I'm your host for today's episode. I am a cognitive behavior psychotherapist specializing in anger management issue, both court appointed and private, marriage counseling, dissociative identity disorders, narcissistic personality disorders, depression, anxiety, and so much more. If you need any assistance, reach out to DMV Counseling and Therapy Services at 301 325 1550. Today, I'm very excited to have our podcast a very special guest, Jonathan McLearnon. Just like every of my past episodes, I will leave it up to him to properly introduce himself, as no one can do a better job. Jonathan, the floor is yours, my friend.
Well, thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. You do a lot of fantastic work in the realm of psychology, and I think you probably have a few letters after your name that I don't have, but I do have a real fascination around behavioral psychology because I think it plays a really key role when it comes to weight loss. And I think a lot of this stems from my own personal weight loss journey. So I've lost over 100 pounds, but um, the question might be, well, how did I get to be, 330 pounds at one point in my life? And in a nutshell, it was I went through some trauma when living in South Africa about 10 years ago, and I really wasn't equipped. I mean, really, I don't think anybody's equipped, but I wasn't well equipped to deal with the fallout from that. So all of the emotional turmoil that I experienced. And so I turned to food, and I essentially became a binge eating food addict because food's more socially acceptable than drugs and alcohol. And it wasn't really that it was this deliberate choice in a sense. Like, it's not like I wanted to become a food addict, but it was kind of more this primal behavior of like, I'm uncomfortable, and food provided the easiest escape. And, that's kind of how our brain works. We have a problem. Like for me, I was feeling really uncomfortable, having flashbacks and rage and things like that. Eat food, I feel better. It's like my brain just learned a trick. And there's also, I think, an element of dissociation because I used to be an athlete. And so,
Oh,
you know, kind of in denial that like I'd gotten as big as I had. And so at some point I kind of had to wake up and sort of accept the reality of my present condition. And yeah, that began this really sort of difficult journey back of trying to find my way back to not being obese. So
so did this lead to depression in some time, or were you not
yeah,
prone to that?
Yeah, it did actually. And this isn't a clinical diagnosis, but my suspicion is that I experienced a condition known as cyclothymia, which I would think you're familiar with. And for those who don't know the term, I would classify it as under the radar bipolar. And so I don't think that like my depressive episodes were severe enough to reach the clinical definition of depression, but because I was experiencing anxiety significantly. At one point, I was having multiple anxiety episodes a day, and the way that I explain it is like it's like redlining an engine. You're revving it way too hot, and the engine then has to basically shut down to cool down before it can start running back at a normal temperature, normal speed. And for me, that would be what depression would look like. It would be like this black cloud. I call it like the cloud of glum would come over my head, and I would just feel really heavy-hearted, really like it wasn't that I was suicidal, but I just like everything seemed to just hurt and ache, and everything was black and seemed bleak, and it was just in this place I had no energy and no desire to do things, even if like logically I knew I should do something to help myself. I had no sort of desire to do that. And then after a couple of days, this would sort of lift. But then there's the fear, of course. Well, when's the next episode going to happen?
Mhm. Yes, absolutely. Now, I know that you became a coach, right? Now you
Hmm.
actually help people go through, especially from what they are now in terms of like overweight or morbidly overweight, to getting healthier. Now, every people will deal with their relationship with food differently. You dealt
Yeah.
with it in some way. Others will have past traumatic disorders that may create a stronger attachment to food. So, how do you help them detach from it?
That's a really good question, and I will say that there might come a point where if someone is outside of my scope of practice, that I would refer out because I'm not a clinical psychologist. Now, I did study marketing psychology, and my coaching certifications are really heavy on behavioral psychology, so I have quite a good understanding, along with my own personal experience. But there will come a point in time if I do realize that someone is clinically beyond my scope of practice that I would refer out. That being said, it doesn't mean that if someone is a severe case that I'm unable to help them. It just we put some boundaries around the work that I'm going to do. I say that we use this information, this understanding of what's happening in the brain, whether there is past trauma, whether there's depression, anxiety. It helps us to inform the behavior, because I like to say that all behavior makes sense. Now, I don't mean that all behavior is good or that all behavior is necessarily helpful, but if we understand what's driving the behavior, even an unhelpful behavior makes sense. We could say, for example, someone who smokes. So we know quite clearly that smoking is not a healthy long-term behavior.
Right.
It's pretty destructive. But in the moment, somebody who's smoking might have the thought, well, I'll quit tomorrow, but just today I need to deal with this problem, and the cigarette solves that problem. It's a great short-term solution, but it's a terrible, destructive long-term solution. So when we kind of understand what's driving the behavior, it means that we can now start to view it with the lens of compassion as opposed to, say, judgment. Because that was, and I think that's something that I struggle with, and a lot of my clients had struggled with, is they would do this thing that they know is not a helpful behavior, and they couldn't seem to figure out why it was they were doing it when logically it didn't make sense. But to help them understand, well, this isn't coming from your prefrontal cortex. It's not coming from the logical part of your brain. This is coming from a more primal part of your brain that really is quite a bit more powerful in one sense. When we have that understanding, like I like to say, that compassionate awareness is the place that change can occur. So we bring that behavior into our conscious awareness. We understand why it's happening. And then when we understand that, we can now say, okay, well, are there some triggers around this? So, if we start to, because very rarely do things just like randomly out of the blue happen. It might seem like it, but very often we can trace it back and find, well, there's actually some triggers. Maybe I was stressed about work, or my kid stressed me out, or things like that. So we start to, chain back and figure out what are some of the triggers causing the behavior to happen. And then we can start to, with that awareness, maybe correct our environment, correct our thinking around it, and so on. And then we can say, well, what's a habit we might want to replace that behavior with?
Interesting. Now, obviously, when you took the example of addiction to smoking
Mm-hmm.
versus addiction to eating, now, obviously, the smoking part is very hard to know someone who is smoking, especially if they're thin. You will not, it's not a visual aspect because
Right. Yeah.
overweight, you could easily see them say, you know what, they have no control over eating, but you will not know the same when someone is smoking. So again, maybe those who are actually smoking are thinking that, well, it's not visual unless if you look at their nails and they're all yellow, or their
Yes.
or their mustache or whatever it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But for everything else, food has a more, I would say, perception to how the person deal with their addiction versus someone who's actually smoking and can hide their addiction.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of the challenges is, smoking has really fallen out of favor publicly, which I think is a good thing, right? It's no longer seen as cool or tough
Correct.
or you know, and so it's a behavior that we recognize. But food is something we have to encounter every day. It's essential to our survival. I mean, yes, you could go a couple of days without food and you're probably not going to die, but essentially we're faced with food every day, and in fact we're faced with hundreds of cues a day that we often see unconsciously reminding us that we should eat.
Yes.
And so for a food addict, for myself, for example, where I really struggled to regulate my emotional impulses around food, it was like torture, because there was a part of me that knew that my eating behaviors were contributing to me being obese, but there was this sense of like almost powerlessness, like victimhood that I felt around it, because it seemed like the only way to shut up the impulses in my head would be to eat.
Yes. Interesting. Have you tried every diet in the world, John? Or I mean,
Well, like
the
it
fat
feels like it.
diet?
Yeah, like I let's say if we look at the spectrum, I've gone from like a raw food vegan, all the way to just about carnivore. And so I
Oh,
think,
okay.
so I've really, it's not necessarily that maybe I've tried every single diet in existence, but I've really spanned the spectrum of eating in terms of attempting to change my own eating behaviors.
Mhm.
And e- all of these things, I think, in a sense, were an attempt to not deal with the real problem.
Okay.
I think there's this fear, especially in the case of trauma, but really, it's like I wouldn't have the strength or the ability to handle like what it was that I was fighting if I was to face up to the truth of it or the reality of it. And so I got really into like supplement science, like high level micronutrition, as well as macronutrition, looking for answers in all the wrong places. It's not that like diets are necessarily, well, I'd say that like something like the Mediterranean diet is recognized as actually a pretty healthy way of eating. but it wasn't really taking care of the root cause of my behaviors around food.
Yes, and actually, you bring up a very good point, John. I'm sure that you're familiar with the TLC show, My 600 Pound Life.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
to now the bariatric surgeon, and he did, before he actually conduct the surgery, he does tell them to go see a psychotherapist
Hmm.
and to be able to also change their behavior and lose 50 to 100 pounds out of their weight before he can conduct the surgery. And that is because he wants them to change their relationship with food first before he can do the surgery. Because obviously, if he just jump and do the surgery, people are going to go back to their old habits. They have not
Yeah.
really fixed the problem. They actually just put a band-aid on it.
Yeah, and that's extremely powerful. And I'm really glad that that is a recognized important step, because bariatric surgery can be a useful tool, and but there's certainly risk. Like I, I think one of the things that bariatric surgeons would try to avoid is this perception that it's a quicker and easy fix.
Mhm.
Like it's actually quite a risky procedure. I have a former client of mine, and she'd had bariatric surgery and lost over 100 pounds. As well, probably over 150. So she'd lost about 50 pounds, had the surgery, lost another 100 pounds. She nearly died a couple of times with like major like mineral deficiencies because she had such a hard time
Yeah.
digesting and absorbing food. So there was some real complications that come from that, and so it's not just like an easy way out. I think it's really important to identify that. And the other side of it is, I think there's a stigma around those who would go through bariatric surgery, and people look at them and say, well, you took the easy way out. But I think the only people that would really use that type of language are those who don't understand the struggle, um, basically, of an addict. Because there's a really interesting course. I think it was on Audible and maybe one of the great courses, and it was called The Addictive Brain, and it went through not just narcotic addiction, but like food and gaming and pornography, and it explained like everything that's happening in the brain, and those who have a greater propensity towards addiction. It's really it's quite something, and unless you experience that struggle, it's really hard to comprehend what it's like.
Now, let's go to the addiction part here, Jonathan.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel that because some people or some actually claim that those who are actually addicted to any kind of food or sex or porn or whatever it is, they have um, weak personalities. They feel that yeah, I mean, it's interesting how
Yeah.
people judge so quickly, really, like you said, without understanding the process in itself. But they kind of say, well, someone who look at food, they could just say to themselves, well, it's not breakfast, it's not lunch, it's not dinner, so I'm not going to snack in between. I should be strong, I should be powerful. I'm not going to let food dictate my behavior or dictate who I am. So does that mean that the majority of people who actually do let themselves go is because they have a part of their brain where they do not process the same information as those who can actually can control themselves?
Yeah, I think it's again, for those who don't understand, I would say I understand why on the surface it would appear like someone has poor impulse control, but we should view that as the symptom. So let's understand why that's taking place. So one simple analogy I like to give is that we have like three or maybe four batteries in our life. It's a physical battery, an emotional battery, a mental or a cognitive battery, and a spiritual battery. And you need to look at all the different factors in your life that are potentially draining those batteries, and then look at where you might be recharging those batteries, and look at the balance of that. And so you think about somebody who's kind of experienced trauma and grapples with addiction and so on, and you think about, like, if they have many, usually there's going to be many other stressors in their life that drive them to this sort of pattern of behavior. And so willpower is a finite resource, and it's one that's kind of fickle. Actually, it's not nearly as reliable as we'd like it to be. And the sad part is, let's just say you resist the urge 100 times in a day, and then you finally break down and give in, and the inclination is, well, I have no willpower. And it's like, no, you used, like, you depleted it, you used it 100 times over successfully, and finally you just had nothing left. Versus someone who doesn't have the struggle. And so those who appear to have the best willpower or the best self-control, what it actually is very rarely is their willpower actually being tested in that way.
Hmm. So if you go back to the food addiction and all, if we talk about your case,
Mm-hmm.
when you were gaining the weight with binge eating, did did you ever felt satisfied when after you ate, or did you feel depressed
No.
because of their eating, or did you feel like, oh damn, here we go, this is an endless cycle that I cannot get out of?
Uh, while I was eating, it was definitely an escape. So there was an element of pleasure to it. I think there was also an element of control. It sounds strange to say it that way because binge eating is really an uncontrolled eating.
Yes.
But there was this element of like, let's say I would go and I'd buy an entire pizza. Pizza
Okay.
was a real trigger food for me, and I was like, I get to eat this, and nobody's going to tell me I can't do it. So it was almost like I was seeking to have control over something in my life because I felt like I was out of control. But the crazy part is, I would get to maybe 5 slices through, and there's still like 3 more in the box, and I'm like filled to the brim. I'm like, I can't finish, but I felt this compulsion that I had to keep eating because I bought the pizza, and even I would actually start to feel this anger or this spite towards myself because I'm like, here we go again. I just did it again, even though I said I was never going to do it again, and I would actually keep eating to now punish myself, to make myself even more physically uncomfortable out of anger towards myself and my sort of seeming lack of self control. So there's a real like void of compassion towards myself in that experience.
So was it like more of a self-destructive mentality that you had, and
Oh
you
yeah,
knew the outcome of feeling too much overweight and not exercising enough and all?
yeah. Like there's a sense of hopelessness. Like I'm never going to get out of this trap. I don't know how to, and I would say like I I didn't know the kind of help that I needed. So I actually tried to hire some coaches to help me lose weight.
Okay.
But the problem is they didn't really know how to deal with someone like me and the struggles that I had. And look, it's not really a knock on them as coaches. They weren't really prepared to deal with someone who was a binge eating food addict who'd been traumatized and grappling with anxiety and depression. Like that's jeepers, that's a mess to dump into someone's lap and say, "Can you help me?" You know. And I didn't really know the kind of help that I needed either. That was a frustrating thing. So it felt like there was this disconnect, like I was misunderstood, like nobody seemed to get me. Nobody seemed to understand what was going, but I didn't really understand what was going on either. And so it was this really frustrating place to be. And there was a coach that I hired back in about 2017, so going a little over 4 years ago, and this really I think was a turning point for me.
Okay.
He was a natural bodybuilder, and I still had this idea in my head: if I had a physique kind of like his, this enviable physique, that I would find happiness. Maybe I would find love. I would actually like, and he didn't treat me the way I expected he would. I I was still quite abusive towards myself. So my negative self-talk was atrocious. If I'd ever talked to another human being the way I talked to myself, like nobody would ever want to associate with me. It was
Wow.
horrible.
Okay.
Yeah, it was brutal. And I projected that onto him. I just assumed that he would see me the way I saw myself, this fat, hopeless loser who could never get anything figured out. And he didn't. He looked at me and he said, "You have potential." And I was like, how could you possibly see that when I'm just like this hopeless loser who's been struggling for 7 years, like with my obesity, you know? And he treated me with compassion, and
Okay.
I didn't know, even like I think I had a misunderstanding around what compassion was, and I was even afraid of it because I was like, if you show me kindness, I'm just going to take advantage of it and continue in my destructive pattern of behavior. I didn't believe that compassion would actually be the key to me breaking free from my destructive pattern of behavior. But he refused to give up on me. There's times I tried to push him away, it, you know, and he wouldn't give up on me, and that's a real testament to him. He never, he never enabled my behaviors, because there's a difference between compassion and enabling.
Yes. Mhm.
And so he didn't enable my destructive behaviors. But at the same time, when I tried to tell him what a loser I was and hopeless, and he should just basically give up on me, he refused. And
That's a
so
true
he,
coach. That's a real good coach, definitely.
yeah. And so he asked me this question, and I said, this is the question that really changed my life. He said, Jonathan, if you make a list of all the things you love and value, how far down that list do I go before I see your name?
Wow. Okay. And how far down
Yeah.
did you have to go to see the name?
It wasn't on there.
It
So
doesn't.
that was a really very, like, in one sense, a very confronting question. Like I was really taken aback and I was speechless because all of a sudden I'm starting to do this calculation. I'm going, I'm not even on the list. Like it hadn't really entered my sphere of consciousness that I was allowed to be on the list, let alone near the top of the list of things I love and value. It just wasn't how I saw myself, and maybe it wasn't how I saw masculinity or male strength. And so now all of a sudden, like my world's kind of been rocked. I'm like, here's this guy that I look up to and I admire because he's successful, he's healthy, he's got a good family and all, and he's got elements, that I'd like to learn from. And he's telling me that like I need to be on this list of things I love and value. What does that even look like? Where do you start? Because men very rarely talk about things like self-love, self-compassion, things
Yes.
like that. So I had no idea where to start even. But that shifted my perspective, and that started me going, okay, the problem isn't really food, is it?
Wow. And how long did it take you to actually lose the 100 pounds, Jonathan?
Permanently, like I say, it took about 6 years.
Okay.
Now people will hear that and they'll go, "Why did it take so long?" And I say, "Well, okay. Truthfully, I probably lost more like 600 pounds,
Okay, yeah,
but
because you gain, you loss, you gain, you loss. Yeah.
right, right. And so, but to lose it permanently, it was probably about 14 months.
14 months. Okay.
Yeah.
Did you have to get like abdominoplasty or any of the
No, no. I mean, I have loose skin, but I mean, like whatever. Like I'm married. My wife loves me. You know,
excellent. Call them
it's
love handles, right?
yeah, exactly. So there's a part of me that's like kind of tempted to some degree, but like I'm like honestly, again, for the risks, the recovery, and all that kind of stuff, I'm like it really doesn't change who I am, and in fact, it's kind of a marker of y- y-
Success.
my success.
Yeah.
And so I don't necessarily strut around with my shirt off or anything like that. And truthfully, I don't have like a fitness model physique. Like I haven't really, it's really not about pursuing aesthetics for me now. It's about functionality. So, for example, I have a young son. He's 7 months old,
Oh,
and
congratulations.
thank you. Yeah, what a what a wonderful blessing because I still have urges. And I think it's important to highlight this. So people would look at my story and think that I've got it all figured out. I never struggle or things like that. And I'm like, no, I'm human.
Okay.
But there's a difference here. So let's just say, for example, I'm going to Costco or we have a store up here called Superstore, and it's a big warehouse type store. And you pass by this like jumbo bag of chips, and you go, "Oh man, I would just love to just demolish that entire
Oh
bag of
yeah.
chips." You're right. The thought still comes into my head, but then I look over at my son, and I go, "What am I teaching him?
Mhm.
And if I go down this path, am I going to be able to be present in his life, or am I have to sit on the couch and be like, sorry, Daddy can't play with you because he can't get down on the floor?"
Yeah.
And it's like, what do I want more? Well, I want to be. I don't want to be a sideline dad. I want to be present in my son's life. I want to be able to I want to be able to run after him. So now, I'm working really hard on my conditioning, because this kid's limbs don't stop moving, and I'm kind of getting like a preview of what's waiting for me as soon as he figures out how to like walk
Oh
and run.
yeah, wait till he hits 2 years old. Terrible twos. I have a 3-year-old, and trust me,
Okay.
it's not fun. It's not fun. I mean, I'm almost 50, so I gotta like
Yeah.
run after him, make sure that he's safe, and this kid can run. He
Yeah.
runs. So yeah, I know exactly. Just expect the unexpected, Jonathan.
Yeah. Well, I said I need to be able to. So I'm working kind of on sprints a little bit. So I've got a recumbent bike, and I do that primarily. So I'll do sprints, and then I'll do like I'm trying to get to 4 miles in 10 minutes.
Okay.
So that's maintaining I got to 3.82 the other day. So I'm getting close.
Okay. Excellent.
Because when I started, I was able to do about 2.97 in 10 minutes, so now I'm up to 3.82.
Okay.
And why 4 miles in 10 minutes? I don't know. I just like round numbers. Um, but the idea is really what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to increase my stamina so that I can keep up with him. So I can sprint after him if I need to, because if he's his head's on a swivel. The kid never sits still. He wrestles his way to be facing forward. He does not snuggle because he has to look at everything happening in the world.
Yes.
And so I can see he takes after me, and that he's intensely curious about the world, and he's trying to go everywhere already. So all of this to say, my love for my son and my desire to be a father and an active and a present father that models healthy behaviors supersedes my desire to binge eat.
I see. Now, what would be an encouraging word that you would have to all the listeners out there, Jonathan, when it comes to them struggling with their weight? If you have to summarize
Yeah.
your 7 years of struggles and both struggles of gaining and losing the weight, of course, what would you tell them to be able to encourage them to move forward?
You're stronger than you realize, for one. Two, I wouldn't actually take the struggles out of my past. Some people think maybe I would want to maybe remove my trauma or things like that. I don't. I'm actually grateful for it because it's in having to go through this struggle, it's really shaped my character and helped me to become the individual that I am today. And so rather than resent the struggle, maybe look at it like you're just a couple
Praise
of
that.
chapters. Yeah, you're a couple of chapters into this incredible potential transformation story. And you're just at the beginning. It's going to be hard, but I've never met a remarkable person who had an easy life. And so if you can work your way through this, you become a remarkable person. And so it's worth it.
Wow. Well, Jonathan, that's all the time we have for today's podcast. I would love to be able to go on for another 2 hours. Um, I really do appreciate the time you took out of your very busy schedule to join us. Thank you also for participating and inspiring our many listeners. Now, we hope you have all enjoyed today's episode. I'm very excited about the many upcoming guests we have scheduled for the Happiness Journey podcast, filled with inspirational stories, just like the one you listened to today. Now, here are a few concluding words of wisdom. Now, if you were able to look back in 2021 at your most brilliant successes, stunning comebacks, amazing catches, and smoking ideas, and you were to find that virtually all of them seemed to materialize out of thin air when you least expected them, and that they had exceeded even your greatest expectation at the time, how excited would you be about the coming new year 2022 and what you're about to accomplish? I'm sure you're getting chills, and they are multiplying. My name is Dr. Dan Amzalag, and you may all keep pursuing your amazing journey in life. Thank you all.